Welcome to Zero. I am Akshat Rathi. This week, the election everyone's talking about. I didn't become a journalist to try to predict what political leaders will do next. But when the climate stakes are as high as they are for the US presidential election in November, we have to understand what the world could look like depending on which way the voters swing. So far, this has been a vibes election. Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are offering very different vibes on climate policy. But beyond the vibes, there are actual policies that they do have in mind. And those policies would lead to very different worlds. To better understand what kind of world we might be living in come January, it's worth grappling with the impacts of those policies. And there's no one better that I could discuss this than with my colleague Jen Dlouhy. She's Bloomberg's energy and environment policy reporter based in DC, and she's always helped me make sense of the ins and outs and complexities of American politics. Jen, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Akshat. I'm glad to be here.
This presidential race did change dramatically 2 months ago when Joe Biden announced that he wasn't running for a second term, and then Kamala Harris became the Democratic nominee. It's a new race. Before that, Trump seemed to be in lead, and he did talk about what he wanted to do with climate policy. He wanted to overturn a lot of the measures in the Inflation Reduction Act that President Biden passed in 2022. So if Trump is elected, what do you think he could do to undo the IRA?
Quite a bit, actually. He would need to work with Congress to achieve a real wholesale repealing of the IRA. And frankly, that would require support from Republicans and Democrats that no one anticipates he would have to really tear it out root and limb. Right now, the likeliest scenario is that both chambers of Congress flip. So that means Democrats would win control of the House and Republicans would take over the Senate. And just as important as which party holds the gavel in each of those chambers is their margin of control. Under almost any scenario, the Senate appears likely to remain narrowly divided, and that will make it difficult for any future president to advance substantive legislation. But administratively, he can do things around the edges of the IRA to chip away at and limit its impact. So, for instance, the Treasury Department under Trump could write new guidelines for tax credits under the IRA, like those for electric vehicles, so they're harder to claim. He'd also have wide berth to make good on his threat to claw back unspent IRA money, especially in the form of grants and loans, basically the cash that hasn't gone out the door. The Biden administration has been working really hard to get grants and loans awarded, but some of those can't actually even be distributed till future years under the law. And it'd be really easy for President Trump to just hit the pause button on any spending that hasn't gone out the door under the IRA. We're talking about tens of billions of dollars still potentially in this category. So that's what he can do on the IRA. There's a lot he can also do to address and roll back climate regulations that have been put in place by Biden over the last 4 years.
What kind of legislations are those?
Right. So we could see a replay of a lot of what Trump did his first term in office to undo Obama-era climate regulations, except this time he would, of course, be attacking Biden-era policies. It's a similar playbook to what he employed the first time around. It's just significantly amped up and likely benefiting from more experienced advisors in key roles, folks who've been around, maybe helped him along the last time he was in office. Starting on day one, he's already said he intends to direct federal agencies to begin repealing and replacing climate regulations. Particularly 2 EPA rules are in the crosshairs. That includes measures that crack down on greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation and power sectors. For the transportation sector, the big target is an EPA rule setting tailpipe pollution limits for cars and light trucks. It's so strict that it compels automakers to sell a lot more electric and hybrid vehicles between 2027 and 2032. It's technically a tech neutral regulation, but Trump and other opponents deride it as an EV mandate since automakers really can't comply just by selling conventional cars. They have to clean up their overall fleet of vehicles to hit these targets. And this is a really important rule. The transportation sector in the US is the largest source of the country's greenhouse gas emissions, about 28% of the total. And within that, cars, pickups, and SUVs are responsible for about 60%, 58 to 60% of those. So this is really important for the US to hit its climate targets, this rule. And yet Trump has made, no bones about it. He's going to target this on day one and set that repeal in motion on day one. He's also repeatedly vowed to terminate the EPA's power plant rule. There's at least one regulation that's in the crosshairs here. It's an EPA rule that limits greenhouse gas emissions from the nation's current fleet of coal power plants, as well as many new gas plants. Trump used a similar strategy last time. So once again, he would be going back to that playbook from his first term in office, using a similar strategy to what he did to attack Obama's clean power plan. In the last term, he replaced that with a rule that required only modest emission reductions at the nation's power plants, really just, what could be achieved through simple improvements in efficiency. And here, if he were to wipe away the Biden rule, you could see a prolonging of the lifespan for American coal plants that otherwise would really have to shut down over the next decade. And it also could encourage the construction of new gas plants, something he's championed.
And on the EV side, there is Elon Musk, who is now supporting Donald Trump. And some of it doesn't make sense, right? Elon does want to sell more electric vehicles. But if Trump is going to attack this rule that will allow car makers to sell more gas cars, what is in it for Elon to support Trump?
It's important to realize that Elon Musk has, of course, a number of interests beyond just Tesla and EVs. But we've seen, this friendship or alliance and financial support with Trump is obviously correlated with a shifting in the former president's rhetoric around EVs. Tesla has, of course, a huge first mover advantage in the US, and that means that it's really already benefited from years selling its cars with the benefit of the EV tax credit, even before the IRA expanded it. So at this point, while the EV tax credit undoubtedly helps encourage sales, it's arguably more important for Tesla's rivals, for the companies that haven't yet significantly penetrated the EV market in the US or found a loyal following. So I think, that's for Tesla supporters, they can perhaps live without this credit in a way that other legacy automakers trying to make EVs cannot.
Now, what I didn't hear you say is Project 2025, because it seems like if you're reading any coverage of elections, Project 2025 comes up. Why is that? Why did you not refer to it?
So Trump has, of course, disavowed the policy blueprint assembled by the Heritage Foundation and dozens of other conservative groups that we know as Project 2025. It's gotten a lot of attention during this campaign cycle. What's interesting to me, covering energy and environment, climate in DC for many, many years now, is that the blueprint that was advanced really included a lot of ideas that were either, at least in the energy and environment space, that were either pursued during Trump's first term in office or are like priorities that are long held by many conservatives in Congress and in Washington. So much of what I saw in the blueprint when it was, released quite a long time ago is not actually surprising to find. It's a rehash of a lot of ideas that have been percolating and circulating in DC for a long time. So for instance, Project 2025 proposed making more federal land available for oil and gas leasing and lowering kind of the costs and hurdles to development in that territory. Well, that's been an objective of both the oil industry and many, many Republicans for years. The blueprint would also scale back the reach of the EPA. It would scale back energy efficiency requirements for household appliances. These are efforts that were both undertaken when Trump was last in the White House and that we would expect to see a repeat of if he were elected again, regardless of whether the Heritage Foundation or other conservative groups had advanced it in this formal agenda. So I think it's important to take Project 2025 seriously. Of course, this is a compendium of ideas that are likely to find purchase in a future administration, even if the former president has disavowed their work product. But I also think it's important to realize that this is old hat in some ways. These are ideas that have been around a long time in the energy environment space.
And talking of no surprises, we've talked about what domestic impact Trump could have. There's also some predictable international impact. The last time around, President Trump pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement. He said he'll do it again this time, right?
Absolutely. He has fully committed to once again exit what he calls kind of the horrendously unfair Paris Climate Accord. Only this time, he could actually start the process his first day in office. Last time, remember, he had to deliberate over it. He actually didn't have his mind fully made up initially. And this time, the U.S. could actually be out of the deal just 1 year after he embarks on that process of exiting the accord, just because of the nature of the way it was written and bound him the first 4 years.
Well, as reporters, I think we should also fact check the horrendously unfair part by acknowledging that the US is the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter cumulatively in history, and of course, the second largest emitter on an annual basis still today. And what is definitely horrendously unfair is that climate impact does affect the poorest around the world.
Right. And Trump could actually go further and abandon the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change that underpins it. And if leaving Paris is a potentially temporary blow to climate diplomacy, then leaving the UNFCCC would be a figurative bomb in climate diplomacy with years of fallout. And what's interesting about this is truly the potentially long repercussions for the U.S. and for the world. The UNFCCC is a treaty. It was ratified by the U.S. Senate in 1992. And if Trump removes U.S. support, it could require another 2/3 vote by the U.S. Senate to get the country back in. And it really could take years to muster the potentially required support to get the U.S. back in, even if you had a supportive president in the White House.
So far, we've talked a lot about what could go wrong on climate policy if President Trump is reelected. After the break, we'll look at what kind of climate policy a Kamala Harris presidency might bring. By the way, if you're enjoying this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It helps other listeners find the show. Jen, I mentioned this being a vibes election, and reporters have criticized Harris for not being detailed enough in her policy proposals on climate in particular. We know that she previously backed the Green New Deal when she was running as a presidential candidate back in the 2020 elections. At that time, she opposed fracking. But now she's changed tone. What else do we know about her thinking on climate today and the kinds of policies that she might be spearheading if she's elected?
Well, I'd say frustratingly, we don't know enough. I'm a reporter who craves a lot more detail than we're seeing from the campaign. It is important to appreciate that Harris was essentially thrust into the middle of a general election campaign where she is courting all voters. In a primary, we typically would see candidates tack to the outer ends of their party. A Democrat would typically embrace more progressive policies, a more climate forward agenda. In the general election, it's seemingly working well for Harris to avoid talking about details that potentially could alienate more moderate voters who aren't necessarily keen on a lot of aggressive climate action. But campaigning is not governing, and Harris really can do a lot administratively, and we would expect her to really continue building on Biden's climate legacy, building on the Inflation Reduction Act, even administratively. So, a top priority is a rather mundane sounding one. It's really continuing to implement the Inflation Reduction Act. There's a bit of a temptation, I think, by folks who work in the space to believe that, 2 years after the law's enactment, it's all finished ground. We can move on to the next step and addressing and improving U.S. climate policy. But there's still tremendous work to get the IRA's programs running, to get dollars flowing. The Treasury Department in the U.S. still hasn't finished writing rules for how people can claim tax credits under the law, including those governing hydrogen production and clean electricity. So there's just a lot of administrative work to be done to kind of unstick this process, to accelerate deployment. I talk with manufacturers and renewable power developers all the time who say they need the government to do more to accelerate deployment, to get these tax credits flowing, and frankly, to deal with funding and permitting bottlenecks. So that's another really important thing that folks are expecting Harris to work on if she's elected and it's not resolved by Congress later this year, really tackling the permitting challenge that is holding back renewables as well as traditional fossil fuel projects. They're just mounting concerns about the hurdles to getting projects permitted and connected to the grid. And, while big permitting reform really does require action from Congress, and Harris may or may not have that kind of supportive environment on Capitol Hill, there is administrative work she could do to accelerate transmission upgrades and get deployment moving faster.
With Trump's policy, we talked about how rolling back tailpipe emissions could really have an impact on transport emissions, which is the largest portion of US emissions. But of course, that's still only 28%. There's all this other stuff that also needs to be decarbonized, right?
Exactly. And we expect a Harris administration would move to impose new rules limiting greenhouse gas emissions from more sources. That includes existing natural gas plants that are going to be asked to produce power longer and harder for meeting the demand that's coming from AI and manufacturing. It also includes industrial facilities like steel mills and cement plants, which right now produce about a quarter of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. So we could expect EPA rules confronting both of those facilities.
One thing that climate reporters noticed at the Democratic convention is how little Kamala Harris talked about climate. She didn't really highlight the green achievements made by President Biden's administration, and climate change only got a passing mention anyway. Then later, during the debate between President Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris, we heard her talk about the surge in US oil production and a need to reduce American reliance on foreign oil. So far, she said little on climate policy directly to reporters. But what she is saying on the public stage, what do you make of it?
I make of it that she feels like she really needs to win Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a politically important state with a lot of votes in the Electoral College, which is what really wins the presidency in the U.S. It also happens to be a top natural gas producer. And so she's trying very hard in this general election, clearly, to thread the needle, to, support broadly action on clean energy that will create jobs for Americans, but also throw a bone to supporters of fossil fuels and say, I'm not going to abandon oil and gas if elected. I'm not going to try to ban fracking, a position I held back in 2019. It's really a bid to court moderate voters, especially in Pennsylvania, which is just such an important swing state for her to win.
But another way to think about what's happening with the climate conversation in 2024 is, to me, it feels like it's going back to normal, because US presidential candidates in general don't talk about climate that much. If anything, the 2020 election was an anomaly where, because of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, Joe Biden was made to talk about climate and then deliver on climate policy. Do you think that's right, that 2020 was the aberration and we're just back to normal now? Even, as we should note, the planet is warming and faster.
I tend to think 2020 is going to be more the normal state of affairs, and what we're seeing now is the exception, just because of this unusual presidential election that, basically saw the introduction of a Democratic nominee into a general election contest. We've moved right into a space where talking about climate can seem polarizing to a certain segment of US voters. And so you have Trump using it to bash the Harris administration, talking about what he calls the Green New Scam. And you have Harris tiptoeing around all of this stuff. My sense is that the urgency of the climate crisis is going to make the 2024 cycle and the way it addressed climate change more of an anomaly. We would expect Harris, were she in a primary contest, to be talking a lot more about all of this.
Well, I did not think we'll come to a hopeful note towards the end of a conversation about US climate policy, but way to get us here, Jen. Now, clearly, one of the candidates doesn't see much benefit talking about climate policy. You and I do. And I've told you this before, but it is an ongoing source of irritation to me that the US, with all its political power, its intellectual heft, its huge amount of capital, doesn't do more on climate. So, if you will, for a moment, imagine with me what the US could do with a president who prioritized climate. We saw some of that under a President Biden, but there's so much more. What do you think the best case scenario could look like?
Let's assume in this world that Kamala Harris is elected and she also is working with a Democratic majority in control of the House and the Senate. In the Senate, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is already committed to taking another bite at the climate apple. So we could see some kind of IRA 2.0. That could take the form of another attempt at something that the Biden administration toyed with and couldn't get across the finish line in the IRA, a clean electricity performance program. That initiative basically would involve government grants that are awarded to electric utilities as long as they're hitting annual clean electricity targets, as long as they're cleaning up the emissions from their power generation. And conversely, laggard utilities that aren't hitting their marks would have to pay fees to the federal government. Critics label them taxes on fossil fuel generation. Again, this idea was popular among many climate activists, 3 years ago, but it just was a little too polarizing to make it into the final IRA deal. But maybe it could be revived in a world where Democrats have, all three centers of power in Washington. We also would expect to see really aggressive action potentially in this world on baking carbon intensity into trade policy. One of the things that has gotten a lot of tongues wagging in DC recently is an opinion piece that was put forward by Brian Deese. He was an economic advisor to both Biden and Obama. He's now actually advising the Harris campaign. And he basically outlined an ambitious vision for a new Marshall Plan for clean energy that would basically use U.S. financing to encourage other countries to deploy clean energy. And the hook is they'd be using clean tech produced in the U.S. Now, this is a big, a bold, a pricey plan. It's one that really would require support from Congress to be fully realized. And so, that's kind of in that category of dream big. Caveat is that even if you're not dreaming big, even if Harris were elected but was working with a Republican Congress, administratively, we can anticipate a little bit more work to bake carbon intensity into trade policy just by virtue of the fact that the EU is already leading us there.
Well, that is dreaming big because right now the US does not make very much of solar panels, batteries, wind turbines, or the kinds of stuff that we really want to deploy. But as you said, the US has to start to dream big. Thank you, Jen, for helping us make sense of this. We will talk a lot more about US climate policy over the next couple of months. And of course, I am looking forward to seeing you at COP29 in Baku in Azerbaijan.
Thanks, Akshat.
Thank you for listening to Zero. And now for the sound of the week.
The thing makes it so... And of course, it's like a graveyard.
Former US President Donald Trump making the sound of a wind turbine. If you have better sounds of wind turbines, please do send it to zeropod@bloomberg.net. If you like this episode, please take a moment to rate or review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Share this episode with a friend or with an undecided US voter. Zero's producer is Maithili Rao. Bloomberg's head of podcasts is Sage Bauman. And head of talk is Brendan Newnham. Our theme music is composed by Wonderly. Special thanks to Kira Bindram and Matthew Griffin. I am Akshat Rathi, back soon.